Okay, so this first video is going to look at the second type of market failure, which is externalities. There are two types of externalities. There's positive and negative externalities. We'll also be looking at why we tax externalities or subsidize different externalities, and what is meant by the terms private and social cost. So externalities arise when a person is engaged in a transaction that affects the well-being of a third party. So what we mean by that is, for example, if you were to purchase a dog, you would be the two parties to the transaction are the buyer and the seller, and the third party may be the person that's up all night because he has to listen to your dog bark. So we're thinking about when we look at transactions, producers only really care about their profits, and consumers care about purchasing at the lowest price. But unfortunately, neither the producer or the consumer in a free market will actually care about these third parties. So externalities arise when a person is engaged in a transaction that affects the well-being of a third party not involved in the transaction. Sometimes transactions have positive externalities for society, and sometimes they have negative externalities. So externalities create a difference between what we call the private and social costs of production. So the social costs of production include everything from all your costs of production that private market will take into consideration. So producers will take into account these private costs, but they won't take into account the third-party external costs that arise. So when I'm deciding to produce, if I decide to emit carbon, if I'm a producer, I will take into account all the costs that are imposed on me or the production costs, but I'm unlikely to care about the pollution that occurs that is affecting external parties. And that's a problem. That's why it's a market failure, because we're not caring about those often devastating effects that these transactions can have on third parties. So social costs include all the private costs plus these costs on third parties. So negative externalities is when the free market over-allocates resources to where they are going to areas where there's going to be negative effects on third parties. Negative externalities in production mean that by producing these goods, it's going to hurt a third party. So one example is when we're transporting goods. If you're using big trucks, they may burn fossil fuels that pollute the air and cause health difficulties for individuals. That would be an example of a third-party cost from that transaction. The same thing with businesses that burn brown coal. If that's going to cause climate change to run, say, electricity for a factory, that is a third-party cost. So climate change may cause droughts, floods, cyclones, rising sea levels in the future. All those negative effects that people and future generations are going to experience are the third-party costs associated with that production. On the flip side, we have negative externalities in consumption, and that means that the externality occurs when we consume the good. So, for example, cigarettes. There's no externality when we produce cigarettes. The externality occurs from passive smoking and increased medical bills when people actually consume these goods. Another example is alcohol. That leads to violence, and it can also lead to health issues that third parties have to pay for. I'm not going to go through all of them, but there is another list, the comprehensive list of negative externalities in consumption. As you can see down the bottom, climate change is another example of a negative externality in consumption, because we also pollute the atmosphere when we drive our cars and use electricity as consumers. So climate change is actually a negative externality in production and consumption. Okay, so what's the aim of the government? Well, the government aim is to regulate the market and to try and internalise these third-party costs of these negative externalities. So in essence, what they want to do is make the producer pay for the effects of the production or the consumption on the third party. And generally, they will do that by taxing the product. And the aim of that is that the higher prices will decrease the demand for the product and therefore reduce the amount of resources allocated to that area. And hopefully we'll shift to substitute products that have a less of a negative externality. So in essence, this is what this graph represents, is that by taxing the producer, we shift the supply curve to the left. Okay? And in essence, we've internalized the social costs of the transaction, the third-party costs of that transaction. And now rather than producing at point QP, we are now producing at point QS, which is a more efficient allocation of resources. We've reduced the amount of resources allocated to this negative externality. So this might be a graph for tobacco or any form of negative externality. Other ways that we can prevent negative externalities, age identification, licensing, laws prohibiting production and consumption. So if we assume that the efficient point of production is for there to be zero, so for example for heroin or marijuana, we may completely prohibit that good or service, and therefore no producer or consumer will produce that in a free market, assuming they don't want to go to jail. Positive externalities, this occurs when the consumption or production causes a benefit to a third party. And these will often be under-allocated in a free market. Because basically what happens is we don't care about, self-interested producers or consumers don't care about the positives that it will have on third parties from their transactions. So examples of positive externalities in production, research and development. When businesses spend money on research and development, say they were doing it to cure cancer, that would have massive positive externalities on lots of third parties. So anyone that was sick would derive benefits from that. So what the government does is they subsidise so that there will be more resources allocated to these areas with positive externalities. It also includes for training of employees, because that training of employees can be used to provide benefits for society, a more skilled workforce. One of the reasons the government subsidise apprenticeships. On the flip side, we have positive externalities in consumption. And these are the main one that you could look at is education. So education in a free market will be provided, but at an inefficient level. It won't be provided at a level that society wants, because lots of people won't be able to afford it. But education has positive externalities for society, because educated people are more likely to pay more tax, be less involved in crime, and therefore the government will subsidise education to increase the amount of education in society to get it to the more efficient outcome. There are other examples of positive externalities in consumption there as well. Water tanks is another example to try and prevent people from using water. That's not theirs. So merit goods. Merit goods are goods that will be provided in a free market, like education, but not at the efficient level. So they were under-allocated in the free market. So what the government does is they subsidise these goods to reduce the cost and make them more widely available. So they're not public goods. They will be provided in a free market. So there will be private schools, for example, but they won't be provided at the efficient level. So here's an example of them subsidising the consumer. So the MPB stands for private benefit or marginal private benefit. SB is the social benefit. So by subsidising it, we allocate more resources to this area, and therefore we get to a more socially efficient outcome. So we are making the product more available, and therefore there's more demand for that service. Other ways that they can encourage positive externalities: produce it themselves, research grants, or legislation. So legislation like having a minimum school leaving age, meaning more people will be educated up to 18 years of age, and therefore the society will get the positive externalities from that. So lastly, what's the aim of this government intervention with negative and positive externalities? Well, what they want to do is they want to shift the allocation of resources, so they want to change relative prices, so if the relative price of things with negative externalities increases and less resources are allocated to that area. So for example, cigarette consumption is taxed, and they want to decrease the relative price of goods that have positive externalities by subsidising production, and more resources will get allocated to that area because it is more profitable. So that's how they work. That is what positive and negative externalities are, and how the government intervenes to try and get a more socially optimal allocation.